Welcome back, guys. In today's episode, I'm sharing 8 true disturbing stories about road trips through the Appalachian wilderness. If you ever plan to drive those hills, these stories might change your mind. But before we begin, please consider subscribing. Don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends and family. I'd also love to hear where you're listening from. Thank you all for your support. It means a lot to me. Now let's start. I was 28 when I'd finally scraped together just enough vacation days to make a proper escape from everything that had been wearing me raw. Callie kept saying we needed to do something we'd still talk about when we were 80 and too tired to do much but sit around with bad coffee and complain. She'd grown up in this crooked little valley in Kentucky and was convinced the best way to really see the hills was to drive every single back road we could find, weaving up and down the ridges until we either ran out of daylight or the energy to keep pretending we had a plan. By the second afternoon, the idea of having any destination at all seemed pretty laughable. We'd peeled off Highway 43 somewhere south of Dalton. Callie swore she knew a shortcut, which turned out to be code for a road that hasn't been on a map since the Eisenhower administration. We hadn't seen more than 2 other vehicles all day, just a battered pickup that passed us going the opposite way and a flatbed with no cab in sight, sitting in the weeds like it had been left behind for someone else to worry about. The pavement turned into gravel without warning, that abrupt shift you always get out there, like the county just decided to give up halfway through paving. Every mile felt like it was stripping away whatever thin layer of security we'd brought along. The world got bigger and emptier all at once. Callie had one elbow hanging out the window, her fingers tapping the door in time with some old country song that kept fading in and out. It was about a guy losing his dog, his house, and his truck in the same sorry week, and I couldn't decide if it was hilarious or depressing. The radio crackled every few seconds like it was about to quit altogether. I kept checking the GPS, but it had frozen more than an hour earlier. The little blue dot sat in a blank patch of green, refusing to budge. After a while, I stopped bothering. Sometime around mid-afternoon, we rolled past this place, so small it didn't even look like a town, just a sad string of houses all tipping sideways in the weeds, porches buckling under their own weight. A gas station sat at the crossroads with no prices left on the sign, just empty slots where the numbers used to be. One house had plastic stapled over every window, strips flapping loose in the breeze like somebody had tried to seal the place up from the inside. "You ever hear of this place?" I asked, mostly just to break the quiet that had settled between us. Allie squinted out the window like she was searching her memory. Used to be coal towns all over these hills. They'd pack up overnight if the company shut down. My grandma told me people just walked away and left everything. Food still in the freezer, clothes hanging in closets, like the place was waiting for them to come back. I tried to picture that. A whole town dissolving into the hills while the rest of the world went on, never bothering to notice. We took another bend in the road, this one sharper than the last, curling around a steep drop-off where the trees pressed right up to the shoulder. The gravel popped under the tires, and for a while, there was nothing but trees crowding in on every side. Then we rounded a hairpin curve and I saw something up ahead on the shoulder. At first, it looked like a tarp or maybe a duffel bag somebody had lost off the back of a truck. But as we rolled closer, I felt my stomach dip. It was a man, slumped against the guardrail. "Callie," I said, my voice cracking just enough to give me away. "Stop, someone's there." She eased the car into a crawl. The engine dropped to a low growl, and the tires spit gravel as we rolled up beside him. He was wearing a faded blue shirt and boots that looked too big, caked with this reddish dust that stuck to everything out here. His knees were pulled tight to his chest. His head drooped forward so far I couldn't see his face. I sat there for a couple seconds, trying to decide if I should get out. My heart was drumming so hard it felt like it might shake something loose inside me. Then I opened the door. The heat hit me first, rising off the gravel in shimmering waves. Underneath it was a faint, metallic smell I couldn't place. "Hey!" I called, trying to make my voice sound calm and helpful, like I had any clue what I was doing. "Do you need help?" He didn't move. Didn't so much as twitch. Callie climbed out too, stopping a few feet behind me. I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. I edged in closer until I could see his chest moving. Shallow little breaths, like he was barely hanging on. That should have reassured me. It didn't. The back of his shirt had a long, ragged tear that gaped open. Underneath, his skin was covered in these dark, repeating impressions, lined up so neat it almost looked deliberate, like someone had pressed a row of heavy coins into his back until the shape was there for good. A cold line traced straight down my spine. "Sir?" I tried again, softer. "Nothing." Callie stepped forward, just enough to put her hand on my shoulder. "We should call someone," she whispered. I nodded, feeling my pulse thumping under my skin. My hand dug around in the side pocket of my backpack, searching for my phone. When I finally pulled it out, I didn't have to check twice. No signal, just the blank screen and the frozen map from an hour back. When I looked up again, he had lifted his head. His face was slack, mouth hanging open like it was too much trouble to keep it closed. But his eyes were pinned right on me. He didn't blink. He didn't even glance at Callie or the car. He started moving his lips, slow and deliberate, like he was practicing each word before he let it out. But nothing reached my ears. I took a step back before I knew I was moving. Callie's hand clamped down on my elbow, her fingers digging in tight. "Get in the car," she said. Her voice was thin and shaking. We edged back together, never turning our backs all the way. The whole time, his mouth kept shaping the same phrase, again and again. Callie climbed behind the wheel and twisted the key. The engine fired up, loud enough to break whatever spell had been hanging over us. She hit the gas and the car jolted forward, gravel rattling against the undercarriage. I twisted in my seat, watching out the back window as he got smaller. He was standing now. His legs looked unsteady, but he started walking after us, step by slow step. With each footfall, a thin line of red bloomed on the gravel behind him, like he was tracking something that clung to his boots. Callie pressed the accelerator harder. The car bounced over ruts so deep I thought we'd lose a tire. My eyes locked on him in the mirror until he was nothing but a speck. But he never looked away. Neither of us said a word, not for at least 20 minutes. The gravel finally turned back to cracked pavement. The trees pulled away, replaced by thin fields and sagging power lines. My phone flickered back to life. No calls, no messages, just that stale timestamp from where we'd last had signal. Callie cleared her throat, but it came out raw like she hadn't spoken in days. "Did you see what he was saying?" I swallowed, and my throat felt tight. I couldn't hear. She pressed her palms flat against the wheel. He was saying, "Don't leave yet," over and over. I didn't know what to do with that. Another 20 miles brought us to this old motel that leaned so far to one side it looked like it might tip over if the wind picked up. We didn't care. We just needed 4 walls and a lock. That night, I lay on the narrow bed, staring up at a water stain shaped like a bird in mid-flight. I replayed the way his lips moved, shaping the same words again and again. Just after midnight, the wind started rattling the loose siding. For one awful minute, I was sure I heard footsteps crunching across the gravel outside, inching closer to the door. I sat up, heart thumping so hard I could feel it in my palms. When the first light slid across the floorboards, I was already dressed and packing my things. We didn't speak until we were miles down the road, heading east, away from that ridge. I was steering my beat-up Corolla through the Blue Ridge foothills, headed toward Nolensville, Tennessee, where my old college friend Meg had settled in a farmhouse she kept promising I'd love. I'd left Bridgeport before sunrise, feeling almost smug about how prepared I was. I had 2 thermoses of coffee, a glove box stuffed with trail maps, and this bright idea to skip the interstates altogether. I thought I'd romanticize the trip. Just me, the car, and a bunch of winding county highways that barely even showed up on the GPS. It sounded charming when I planned it out at my kitchen table, By the second afternoon, though, I was starting to question my life choices. Sometime after lunch, the last bar of cell signal disappeared. My dashboard clock kept ticking along like nothing was wrong. But out there, I felt like I'd slipped off the map completely. I couldn't remember the last time I'd passed a gas station or even a mailbox. I pulled off onto this graveled turnout that looked more like a logging access than any real parking area, just so I could stretch and look over my printed map again. For a while, I sat there, pretending I wasn't unsettled by how absolutely quiet it was. No tractors rumbling in a field, no trucks shifting gears on a distant grade, not even the lazy drone of a plane overhead. I stepped out and did a slow stretch until my shoulders cracked. The air felt heavy somehow, like the woods were pressing in, waiting for me to get back in the car and leave them alone. I leaned against the door and unfolded the map across the hood, tracing my route with one finger, trying to act like I had it all under control. That was the moment I realized there was a truck behind me. No engine sound, no crunch of gravel. One heartbeat, the road was empty. The next, a rust-red pickup sat about 20 yards back, headlights off, parked so close to the ditch it looked half sunken into the grass. I tried to see who was inside, but the cab windows were tinted darker than a welding mask. I waited, thinking they'd wave or at least flash their lights. Nothing. The truck sat there idling, exhaust puffing in this slow, uneven rhythm that made it sound like it might stall out any second. I did a sort of half-wave, like maybe the driver was trying to see if I was stranded. No reaction at all. My mouth went dry, and I couldn't have said why. I just knew something felt off in a way that went deeper than logic. I folded the map and climbed back into the car, shutting the door carefully so it didn't slam. My pulse was tapping at the hollow of my throat. The second I turned the key in the ignition, the truck eased forward. It moved so deliberately, rolling up until it hovered just behind my bumper, close enough that if I'd braked too fast, they would have tapped me. I kept my eyes locked on the rearview mirror, half waiting for the driver to swing their door open and come striding up to my window. I eased back onto the road, trying to look like I hadn't noticed them. The truck matched my speed exactly. I sped up a little. So did they. Slowed down. Same thing. For the better part of a mile, I held on to the hope they'd pull around and pass. But the pickup just hovered there, always the same distance behind, engine growling low. Eventually, the road curved around a stand of hickories and I saw my chance. The shoulder widened into a second lane that branched off toward a state maintenance road. I veered onto it without signaling, heart hammering. When I looked back, the truck was gone. I can't explain the way my lungs finally unlocked. I told myself I'd probably spooked some local by parking on the turnout. Maybe they were checking I wasn't dumping trash or looking to poach deer. But in the back of my mind, something kept scraping at me, insisting it hadn't been that innocent. I drove for another 10 minutes without seeing so much as a mailbox. My thoughts started drifting back to the gas gauge, which was already flirting with the red zone, and my stomach had been growling so long it felt like white noise. I'd planned to camp that night in Baynard State Forest, a little patch of managed land my guidebook swore had clear trails and a maintained campsite. When I pulled into the dirt lot, my headlights swept across a single car. It was an old station wagon, with one rear tire shredded flat, a faded blue tarp draped over the tailgate. I parked as far away as I could without backing into a tree. The woods here felt denser than anything I'd driven through all day. The last daylight was slanting away fast, and I had this creeping sense the trees were swallowing the road behind me. I sat there for a minute, telling myself I could always keep driving, but the gas light blinked on, steady and accusing. I knew I was out of options. I stepped out, unpacked my tent, and tried to ignore the way my scalp prickled every time I glanced at that station wagon. Its back window was so dusted over it looked opaque. I kept imagining someone crouched inside, holding their breath. The trail that led to the campground was barely marked, just 2 wooden stakes and a flattened swath of grass. A row of sun-bleached notices about black bears fluttered in the breeze. About 100 yards in, I saw them. Deep, fresh tire tracks pressed into the dirt. Wide and heavy, I stopped and stared. There weren't supposed to be any vehicles back here. No service roads. No clearings big enough to turn around. I tried telling myself maybe a ranger had driven through to check the site. But something in me knew better. I picked a spot to pitch my tent where I could watch the trail but still feel tucked back enough not to be obvious. My hands wouldn't stop trembling as I drove the stakes into the dirt. By the time I finished, the cold had settled in fully, seeping up through the soles of my shoes. I ate a quick meal, sitting cross-legged with my back against a downed log. The hatchet stayed balanced across my knees. Every few minutes I closed my eyes and listened. But the woods stayed still. I crawled into the tent sometime after 11. Even zipped up in my sleeping bag, I couldn't convince my body to relax. My heart thumped on, steady and loud. I don't know how long I lay there staring at the ceiling. Long enough that when the headlights finally swept across the nylon, it took me a second to understand what I was seeing. The beams moved in a slow arc, back and forth, like someone was scanning the clearing. Then they reversed and pinned the tent square on. My breath stopped in my throat. The engine idled with that same ragged rhythm. I heard the door creak open, then footsteps. Slow, measured. Leaves shifted under boots. They circled the tent once, paused, circled again. Each time they stopped, it felt like they were studying me, trying to figure out if I was alone. I wrapped my hand around the hatchet handle so tight my wrist started to cramp. The footsteps stopped directly behind my head. I could see the vague outline of boots pressed against the fabric. They never spoke. I told myself if I stayed perfectly still, they'd leave. But instead, they took a single step closer, close enough that I heard the shift of their weight. Slowly, I reached for the zipper. My heart slammed so hard against my ribs I thought it would crack something. Then, just as suddenly, the steps receded. One careful stride after another. I heard the door close. The engine never turned off. I inched the zipper open, just enough to look through. The rust-red pickup sat in the trail, headlights glaring. A figure stood beside the driver's door, perfectly motionless. From that angle, I still couldn't see a face. I didn't wait for them to move. I slipped out of the tent, clutching the hatchet, and crept into the trees. Every step felt too loud, like the leaves were conspiring to give me away. When I reached the trail back to the parking lot, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The headlights were still fixed on the clearing. I circled wide around the lot, heart drumming against my ribs. My car looked impossibly small and far away. Then I ran. I didn't look back. I unlocked the door with shaking hands, threw the hatchet onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. I reversed so fast the tires spat gravel behind me, then peeled onto the main road without checking my mirrors. I drove until I hit the outskirts of a town called Walden's Crossing. The first gas station looked like a lighthouse, bright halogen lights spilling onto the pavement, turning everything blue-white. I pulled up to the pump, engine running, and tried to breathe. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. After 10 minutes, I finally picked up my phone and called the county sheriff. The dispatcher sounded tired but patient. She promised to send a patrol out to check the trail. I was working as a freelance surveyor. Mostly it meant weeks on the road by myself, driving down roads so empty they didn't even bother striping the center lines, poking around pieces of land that nobody cared about except the county office and whichever bank was stuck with them. In early October, I picked up this job to document a parcel buried somewhere in the Blue Ridge foothills. It sounded straightforward. Some photos, a sketch of the property lines, confirmed the place hadn't been developed or turned into a junkyard. I'd been feeling cooped up in that tiny rented room above a florist shop in Radley. The walls smelled faintly of old potpourri, no matter how much I tried to air the place out. So I figured I'd stretch the job into a 3-day trip, just a little break to clear my head. I left before dawn, thinking I'd make good time. The highway was empty, and I had that small sense of freedom you get when you know no one expects to hear from you all day. The sun came up behind me, and by the time I turned onto County Route 219, a thin veil of fog had started to burn off. I remember watching it drift in patches across the road, like it couldn't decide whether to leave. The last town I passed was called Dunning Creek. I only knew that because of the peeling billboard on the way in. Welcome to Dunning Creek, with a painted trout that looked like it was about to slide right off the wood. The town itself had one gas station, a diner with plywood nailed over the windows, and a little post office that might or might not have been open. I topped off the tank just in case. The teenager behind the counter didn't ask where I was going, and I didn't offer. After that, the road shrank down to a cracked two-lane that felt like it had been paved once and then abandoned to see how long it could last. My cell service disappeared in fits and starts. One minute I had half a bar, the next, nothing but the little SOS symbol. I tried not to think about it. The directions said to stay on County Route 219 for 40 miles, then turn onto Sparrow Lane. What they didn't say was that Sparrow Lane looked like it had been cut by a tractor 50 years back and never improved. The asphalt was split into long seams, weeds pushing up through the cracks. Every so often I passed a listing mailbox or the remains of a barn so collapsed it looked more like a pile of driftwood. About halfway down, I spotted a sign nailed to a crooked post. Mathis Hollow, 8 miles. That was the name on my work order. 8 miles, easy enough. Except it wasn't 8 easy miles. It was nearly an hour of switchbacks that clung to the slope in a way that made my palms damp on the wheel. There wasn't a shoulder, just a thin edge of gravel that disappeared into trees. I kept telling myself it was fine, that if anything went wrong, I'd just back up carefully. But part of me knew there wouldn't be space to turn around. I didn't see another vehicle the whole time. No pickup trucks parked along the road, no tire marks. It felt like the trees were swallowing the last trace of everything. Eventually, the woods fell away just enough that I caught a glimpse of the house down in the hollow. 2 stories of weathered wood, no paint left, every window covered in boards. A stone wall ran along the front yard, most of it crumbled into a pile of mossy blocks. I pulled in next to what was left of the wall and shut the engine off. The sudden silence was so complete it felt like I'd stepped into a vacuum. I sat there a minute, with my hands still on the key, listening to my own pulse thudding in my ears. I got out, telling myself this was no different from any of the other abandoned properties I documented. Just a job. The air felt still and expectant though, like the place had been waiting to see who would come looking. I slung the camera over my shoulder and started circling the house. Each window was boarded tight. Some of the planks looked newer than the others, fresh cuts, clean edges. Someone had been out there more recently than the rest of the place suggested. That part stuck with me. I snapped photos of every side, making sure to get wide shots of the roof line and foundation. The ground was littered with broken shingles, scraps of old tar paper that stuck to my boots. When I stepped around the back corner, my heels skidded on loose gravel. I threw a hand out to catch my balance. That's when I noticed the car, a dark green sedan, tucked behind a stand of scrubby weeds. All 4 doors shut, no license plate. The paint looked too clean to have been there long. I hadn't heard an engine, hadn't seen tire tracks coming up the drive. My mouth went dry. I crouched a little, trying to see inside, but the glare off the windows was too strong to make out much. It felt wrong, the way it just sat there, like it was waiting. I took 3 quick photos and backed away, telling myself it was probably nothing, just an old car someone dumped. I'd almost made it to the front steps when I heard gravel shift behind me. Need help with something? It wasn't loud, but it cut through the quiet in a way that made my scalp prickle. I turned so fast my knee nearly gave out. A man stood by the corner I'd just walked past. He looked older than me. Thin face, skin pale enough that it almost blended into the boards behind him. He wore a canvas jacket, one sleeve darker like it had gotten wet and never dried out. His eyes were small and steady, He didn't blink. I cleared my throat. Just documenting for the county. Survey records. I held the camera up a few inches like it was a badge. He tipped his head to one side, studying me. "That's your car up front?" "Yeah." He didn't nod or smile, just kept staring. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then he turned and slipped behind the corner without a sound. My heart went ballistic. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself to look around the house and see where he'd gone. I couldn't do it. I forced my legs to move, slow and steady, across the yard. When I got into the driver's seat, I locked the doors so fast my thumb nearly missed the button. Backing out, I checked every mirror. The sedan didn't move. No sign of the man. I drove on, and after a while the trees began to flatten out into something that looked like normal forest again. I thought maybe I'd shaken it off. Then I saw another sign nailed to a post. Mathis Hollow, 6 miles. My foot hit the brakes so hard the car jerked. I stared at the sign, trying to make sense of it. No forks, no junctions. I hadn't turned around. I eased forward, repeating to myself that it was just an old sign someone hadn't taken down. But 20 minutes later, the same roofline came into view. Same sagging wall. Same boards nailed across the windows. The same green sedan waiting behind the house. I didn't stop. My mouth felt sour, like I'd been sucking on a coin. I kept going, not looking anywhere but the road. The curves started to feel impossible, like the road was folding back over itself again and again. Dusk settled in, slow and heavy, until I couldn't see much beyond the headlights. When I finally saw a strip of pavement that looked different and the glow of porch lights, I almost laughed. The road spit me out into a crumbling lot in front of a convenience store. The sign above the door was hand-painted. The parking spaces were just patches of dirt. Inside, a woman behind the counter lifted her eyes and looked at me in this calm, resigned way, like she already knew why I was there. "You look a little lost," she said. "I think I am." My voice cracked on the last word. "I've been trying to find Mathis Hollow for a survey." She didn't say anything right away, just turned her head like she was listening for something out in the dark. "Not a place you want to be looking for after sunset," she said finally. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. I bought a bottle of water. When I got back in the car, I sat there a long time with the engine off, waiting for my hands to stop shaking. When dawn finally broke, I drove west. I left the paperwork unfinished on the passenger seat. I didn't look in the rearview mirror to see if the green sedan was following me out. As a surveyor in my 30s, I'd gotten used to spending weeks alone in places nobody cared about anymore. Overgrown pastures, boarded-up churches, forgotten logging roads. If it was on a map, I'd probably have been there at some point with a clipboard and a thermos of coffee. That October, a developer named Carl Whitlow hired me to map out property lines way out in the southern stretch of the Blue Ridge. He kept saying he wanted to honor the land's history, but everything about the contract screamed he planned to bulldoze whatever he found. Not my problem, though. I'd been behind on rent for 2 months, and the job was going to pay enough to catch me up. So I packed up the essentials: survey gear, work boots, an overstuffed duffel with 3 days of clothes I'd probably stretch into a week, and a plastic bin full of instant noodles. I left my place in Somerville around 4 in the morning and drove straight through of 11 hours behind the wheel, broken up only by one stop at a gas station where the bathroom smelled like an old fish tank. The first part of the trip felt like any other. My maps were folded on the passenger seat, the thermos balanced between my knees. The GPS was still chirping helpfully when the highways narrowed down to patched 2-lane roads, then to gravel that looked more like someone's private driveway. About 50 miles past the last gas pump, I passed a boarded-up diner with a faded sign that said Dodd's Place in flaking red paint. The windows were covered in plywood, and there was an old rocking chair tipped over on the porch. I remember thinking that if this were a horror movie, that'd be my cue to turn around. I didn't. Not long after the diner, the GPS froze. The screen locked onto a T-junction I definitely wasn't at. I tapped it a couple of times, gave it the kind of annoyed look you give a printer that won't work, and waited for the satellite to catch up. Nothing. I pulled over next to a row of pines and spread out the printed directions on my hood. Some of the names had blurred where I'd spilled water weeks earlier. I tried to line up the roads with where I thought I was, tracing my finger over the lines. My brain felt cottony from the long drive, like nothing wanted to connect. Eventually, I picked a fork to the right, mostly out of desperation. The road wound uphill in a slow curve, and I tried to reassure myself I'd see some landmark from the file. An old grain silo, a collapsed barn, anything to prove I hadn't wandered onto private land. But the longer I drove, the less I saw. Just more trees pressing in from both sides, and the kind of silence that makes you feel like the last person left on Earth. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, my headlights looked weak, barely cutting the shadows. Every mile or so, I passed a driveway blocked by a rusted cattle gate or a stack of cinder blocks. The mailboxes were long gone, and even the numbers were missing from the posts. About 10 minutes past the last driveway, something flickered in my rearview mirror. I braked, more out of reflex than anything else. There was a wooden cross standing in the middle of the road behind me. I sat there with my hands locked on the wheel, trying to process it. The cross hadn't been there 2 seconds earlier. I opened the door and stepped out, gravel shifting under my boots. The cross was maybe 2 feet tall, nailed together from rough boards, with a strip of faded red cloth tied around the center. Up close, I could see the ends were freshly cut. Pale wood that hadn't had time to gray in the weather. I crouched beside it. There was no mound of dirt, no sign it had been moved or dropped. It was just there, planted perfectly upright. I didn't touch it. I backed away and got in the car, trying not to imagine who or what had set it there while I wasn't looking. Another mile ahead, the gravel turned soft. My tires sank an inch, then 2, with this slow, deliberate sag that felt personal somehow. I tried to ease forward, but the ground swallowed the front wheels in a heavy slump. I shifted into reverse and hit the gas. The tires spun, spraying wet grit against the undercarriage. No movement. My heart was hammering now, in this fast, shallow way that made me feel a little dizzy. I turned off the engine, climbed out, and squatted next to the front wheel. The dirt was smooth everywhere except where my tires were buried, like it had decided to give way just for me. I got the folding shovel from the trunk and started digging. The dirt came up in thick, wet clumps that clung to the blade. My shoulders were already trembling by the time I'd cleared enough to see the tread again. I tried the engine. Just a sick little sputter and nothing else. It was fully dark now. The road behind me looked like a tunnel. My phone was still dead. I had 1 bar the last time I checked, but even that had vanished. I stood by the hood for a minute, telling myself I'd wait in the car until daylight. But the thought of sitting there in the dark with those crosses made my skin crawl. So I locked the doors, took my flashlight, and started walking uphill. At the first bend, I stopped so fast my boots skidded. Another cross stood right in the middle of the road. Same size, same strip of cloth. I exhaled slow. Like maybe if I acted calm, this would make sense, somehow. I stepped around it and kept walking. My flashlight beam jittered across the road. 100 yards later, another cross. Then another. Some were taller, some shorter. All freshly cut, the same pale wood, the same red cloth. I started counting without meaning to. 4, 5, 6. By the time I passed the 9th, my pulse was in my ears. That's when I heard footsteps in the trees to my left. 1 step, then nothing. I stopped listening. The dark was thick enough. It felt like it pressed on my shoulders. Hello? My voice sounded thin, almost comical. I kept moving faster this time. My boots crunched on the gravel, loud in the quiet. At the 12th cross, the footsteps started again, matching my pace just out of sight. I kept my eyes fixed ahead. When I reached the 15th, a voice called out, "You're on private land." It was close. Closer than I wanted to think about. The tone was flat, neither friendly nor angry. Just a statement, like reading off a list. "My car's stuck," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just need help." Silence. The footsteps shifted, angling across the slope. At the 17th cross, my boot hit something hard. I looked down and saw a piece of bone wedged in the dirt. I swallowed, hard enough it hurt. The voice came again, softer. "You shouldn't be here." I turned just enough to see trees shifting, like something big and low to the ground was moving through them. My knees went to rubber. I turned back to the road and ran. I counted crosses as they blurred past. 19, 20, 21. At the next bend, the road straightened. My flashlight picked out a shape ahead. My car sunk to the axles exactly as I'd left it. I stopped so hard I almost fell. My breath sounded ragged in the quiet. The voice floated out from behind me. "It's waiting." That was enough. I sprinted to the driver's side, yanked the door open, and climbed in. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in. The first turn, nothing. The second, a flicker of the dashboard lights. The third, a cough. Then the engine caught. I threw it into reverse. The tires sucked free with a sound I'll never forget, and the car lurched backward onto gravel. I didn't look behind me. Didn't slow down until the trees gave way to cracked pavement. When I finally spotted the glow of a Gulf Station canopy, it looked so bright and clean it felt unreal. I pulled up to the first pump and killed the engine. My hands were still trembling as I set the brake. I sat there a long time, just breathing, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined any of it. But in the end, I don't know who put those crosses there. All I know is I kept driving and didn't look back. When my last freelance contract wrapped up, I didn't bother lining up the next one. I threw a couple bags in the back seat, topped off the tank, and started north out of southern Georgia with no deadline and no plan except to keep moving until something made me stop. By the third morning, I was already starting to feel different. A little lighter, maybe. Like the part of me that always worried about bills and inboxes had finally gotten bored and gone to sleep. I left a sagging little motel outside Marion before sunrise. The place had smelled like old carpet and something a little sweet, maybe cleaning fluid that never really did the job. I'd barely slept. Mostly I lay there listening to the cheap HVAC unit click on and off and wondering if I was already in over my head. But the second I hit the road, the nerves turned into this restless energy, like I was chasing something I couldn't quite name. I followed Highway 2 and 21, just watching the sky get lighter and telling myself I'd figure out the rest along the way. My only loose goal was to cross into Virginia before night fell. It was about 50 miles past town when I noticed a wooden sign nailed to a leaning post on the right shoulder. The thing looked like it had been there since the 60s, paint flaking off in big curls. Even half faded, I could still read it. Walden Trace Historic Route. It wasn't on my atlas. My GPS acted like it didn't exist, which honestly made me more interested. I pulled over onto the gravel, let the engine idle, and spread the map across the steering wheel. There was just empty space between the highway and a patch of green labeled Merrill Game Lands. Nothing about a historic route. I sat there with my fingers pressed to the paper, trying to come up with a normal explanation. Maybe it was a decommissioned scenic drive. Maybe it used to be important and now it was just a local shortcut nobody bothered to remove the signs for. But the more I stared at that name, the more familiar it felt, though I couldn't place why. It was early enough that I figured there was no harm in taking a look. I turned in. The road changed almost immediately. The pavement was warped and cracked, like the earth underneath it had been shifting for years. Every 100 feet or so, the car rocked gently to one side, just enough to make me grip the wheel tighter. The trees closed in faster than I expected. No gradual transition. Just suddenly they were crowding both sides, tall and uniform, their trunks a pale gray that looked almost deliberate. Not even a mile in, I passed a mile marker stamped with a wooden 1. Maybe half a mile past that, another marker appeared. This one was different, painted white numerals instead of carved. I slowed to a crawl. My tires crunched over loose gravel that had crept out onto the asphalt. Then I saw the third marker. It didn't have a number at all, just a black figure, human-shaped, arms raised overhead in a way that didn't look celebratory. I don't scare easily. I grew up in a house where my dad left horror movies on the TV all night. But something about that symbol made my chest tight. I rested both hands on the wheel and tried to make sense of it. Maybe a forestry boundary? Some old survey marker? Maybe a joke someone played decades ago? None of it fit. I told myself I'd keep going just long enough to satisfy my curiosity. Another mile or two, that's all. The pavement ended without ceremony, replaced by a rutted gravel track with weeds pushing up through the tire grooves. I almost stopped right there. Almost. But admitting I was nervous felt like conceding to something I didn't understand. So I drove on. Around the next bend, a pickup truck sat nose down in a shallow ditch. The hood was folded in on itself like an accordion. Front tires turned sharply toward the trees. The windshield was so cracked it looked opaque. Nobody in sight. The driver's door hung open, swinging a little in the breeze that funneled through the trees. I coasted past slow enough that the engine dipped into an idle. I leaned over to look for anything. Blood, footprints, a note. There was nothing. No sign anyone had even tried to climb out or flag down help. I swallowed, or tried to. My throat felt like it was full of dust. I told myself I'd call it in when I got back to a main road. A few hundred yards farther along, something caught my eye. A plastic grocery bag sitting perfectly upright in the center of the track. White with blue letters, the kind you see tumbling along parking lots. Only it wasn't moving at all. I eased around it, careful not to clip it with the side mirror. I checked the rearview mirror once I'd passed. Another identical bag had appeared behind me, sitting the same way. I stopped the car. My palms left damp marks on the wheel. I made a three-point turn, tires spitting gravel, and pointed back the way I'd come. I'd barely gone half a mile when I spotted that same marker again. The stick figure. I shifted into reverse and backed up until I reached a patch wide enough to stop. I got out, figuring if I walked for a few yards I'd spot the turn I must have missed. Only when I looked over my shoulder, the road behind me was gone. A wall of saplings stood there, pale trunks spaced exactly the same distance apart. 15 feet high, maybe. I walked right up to them and pressed my hand into the branches. They bent like green rubber and snapped back to perfect formation the second I let go. My fingers came away sticky, coated in clear resin that hardened almost immediately. I scraped at it with my thumb and got nowhere. I climbed back into the car and sat behind the wheel, hands trembling hard enough that I couldn't get the key into the ignition on the first try. When the engine finally turned over, it sounded too loud in the hush. I drove forward. No bags now, no markers, just curve after curve, the gravel road angling gently up toward a ridge. I checked my odometer to see how far I'd gone. 0 miles. Checked again. Still 0. I started talking out loud, telling myself this was fatigue, that the road wasn't really looping. But it sounded ridiculous even to me. I don't know how much time passed before I saw the cinder block building. It sat back from the road, squat and gray, with a flat roof and no windows, a metal door with chipped paint. The sign over it said restroom, though it didn't look like any bathroom I'd ever seen. I stopped and climbed out because I decided if there was someone inside, all of this would finally make sense. I opened the door. The air shifted, like it was exhaling around me. I stepped inside. The door swung shut behind me with a quiet, decisive click. The room was empty, except for a wooden chair in the center. A flip phone rested on the seat, screen glowing faint blue. It started ringing. I didn't want to touch it, but the ringing stopped after 3 tones. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown caller. I answered. A man's voice whispered, "Sit in the chair." I stepped back so fast I hit the cinder block wall with my shoulder. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The flip phone started ringing again. I picked it up, hoping the voice would be different. It wasn't. "Sit in the chair." I threw the phone. It broke apart against the far wall, pieces scattering like startled insects. I turned back to grab the door handle. The door was gone. Just smooth concrete. I pounded the wall until my hands hurt, until my voice was hoarse from yelling. Something behind me shifted. A slow, deliberate creak of wood under weight. I didn't look. I knew if I did, I'd see something sitting in that chair. I pressed my forehead against the wall, eyes squeezed shut. I told myself I was leaving. I opened my eyes. The door was back. I didn't think. I yanked it open and ran. I didn't care if the trees closed in again. I didn't care if something followed. I got in the car and drove at the first stretch of gravel that looked like it went anywhere different. After maybe a minute, the gravel turned back to fractured pavement. Another minute after that, I burst out onto the highway. I spent weeks out in places most people wouldn't bother to glance at on a map, let alone visit. That October, Meridian Transport contracted me to update a set of state highway and service road maps. They wanted every last back road and maintenance lane cataloged, right down to the barely visible ruts. It was the sort of tedious job where you'd swear your brain was going numb, but the paycheck was big enough that I couldn't justify turning it down. That particular morning, I was deep in the bluegrass foothills, inching along a county road that had turned from cracked asphalt into coarse gravel so gradually I only noticed when the steering wheel started vibrating in my hands. My GPS had given up about 10 miles back, and my phone was doing its usual trick of showing a single bar that liked to vanish the second I thought I had a signal. I wasn't too bothered. I'd learned to expect this out in the middle of nowhere. I had a jerry can of extra fuel, enough canned food to get me through the week if something went sideways, and a stack of laminated survey charts that should have covered every path, spur, and deer trail in a 30-mile radius. Most of those charts were dated around 1974, which was probably the last time anyone had officially checked whether these roads even existed. Around noon, I came around this shallow bend, and there it was. A narrow lane splitting off to the right. It looked like a couple of ruts trying to pretend they were a road, half overgrown with saplings that hadn't been trimmed in decades. On the chart, there was a faint dotted line labeled Access Route 19D. Supposedly, it curved back around to Highway 54 eventually, assuming the path hadn't vanished altogether. I pulled over and killed the engine, thinking I'd snap a photo, jot down the location, and call it good. My plan was to log as many side trails as I could before dark and then get back to a motel in Wexler for something hot to eat and a place to stretch my legs. I stepped out into that heavy stillness you only get when you're too far from any farm or town for noise to follow you. No breeze, no distant hum of machinery, just the soft crackle of dead leaves shifting under my boots. I stood there a minute, taking it in. Because as much as I complain about this job, there's a weird peace in that kind of silence. I photographed the track entrance, marked the coordinates, and glanced at my watch. Plenty of daylight left. Against what I'd call my better judgment, I told myself it wouldn't hurt to drive in just a little, just far enough to see if the road was still drivable past the tree line. I always had this dumb optimism that the next old road would be the one that didn't turn into a swamp. The lane narrowed fast. Within a quarter mile, the trees were pressing in so tight that the mirrors brushed against trunks on both sides. The road felt less like a path and more like a tunnel someone had forgotten to finish clearing. Every now and then, I caught a glimpse of crumbling blacktop under the moss, but mostly it was just hard-packed ruts. I saw the first stake maybe 10 minutes later. A rough chunk of timber, driven into the shoulder, capped with a sloppy daub of bright red paint. It didn't match any markers on my charts. I leaned out my window and stared at it, thinking it looked too fresh to be a relic from old surveys. Maybe a property boundary? Though out here that felt unlikely. I kept going, telling myself I'd just record a few more points. Another 100 yards brought me to a second stake, then a third one, tilted a little sideways, like whoever had stuck it in the ground hadn't bothered to check if it was straight. Something in my gut tightened. I eased the car to a stop. I knew it was time to back out. But then, Maybe because the job was wearing on my nerves, maybe because I didn't want to feel like I'd driven all this way for nothing, I decided to walk ahead for a few quick photos. I left the engine idling and walked about 20 paces up the ruts, camera in hand. Up close, each stake had a shallow groove carved near the top, neat and deliberate. I was leaning in to get a close shot of the groove when, for no clear reason, I turned around. That's when I saw the fourth stake. It was planted right behind my car, dead center in the path. I felt my heart stutter. I knew, without a shred of doubt, it hadn't been there a minute ago. I scanned the trees, trying to catch any movement. Nothing. No branches shifting, no footsteps. My mouth had gone dry, and my chest felt like it was cinched tight. I tried to come up with some explanation. Maybe I'd driven past it and didn't notice. Maybe it fell over and someone set it back up. But there was no way. I'd been watching the track the whole time. I backed away, careful not to turn my back on that red-tipped post. My hand was trembling when I reached for the door handle. I turned the key, and when the engine caught, I almost laughed with relief. I started to reverse, inching the wheels over the middle of the track. Not 2 seconds later, I felt the back tires dip hard, like the earth had swallowed them. I eased off the gas and checked the mirror. Both wheels were sunk into a hollow I would have sworn hadn't existed before. I climbed out, trying to keep my breathing steady. Under the back tires, the ground was churned into thick, black mud. The rest of the track looked dry. Just under my wheels, it was falling apart. I went around to the hatch and grabbed my emergency shovel. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it. As I dug out the mud, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see another stake pop up behind me. The road felt wrong, like it was changing when I wasn't looking straight at it. After what felt like forever, I wedged an old board under the tire and climbed back in. I turned the ignition. The dashboard lit up once, then went dark. I tried again. Nothing. That's when I heard it. 3 slow knocks, echoing from somewhere up ahead. Steady, deliberate, not wind, not a falling branch. A rhythm someone, or something, was keeping. I opened the door, heart hammering, and stood up. The knocking stopped. I didn't bother yelling. My voice felt lodged somewhere behind my ribs. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started walking. My brain had reduced itself to a single idea. Keep moving. Don't stop. A few hundred yards on, another stake waited in the center of the path. I didn't pause. I stepped around it like it was a snake I didn't have time to deal with. The knocking picked up again, closer now. Every time I tried to pinpoint it, it slipped behind me, then ahead, like it was pacing me, deciding how fast I was willing to walk. At one point, I glanced back and saw a strip of pale cloth hanging from a branch. It fluttered once, then stilled. My legs turned to water. Eventually, the trees thinned into a wide clearing. In the center stood a battered trailer perched on cinder blocks. All the windows were blacked out with something that looked too dark to be paint. Fresh boot prints trailed through the mud to the steps. I stopped just long enough to take it in. Whoever had set the stakes was probably watching me right then. I felt it in my spine. I didn't go near the trailer. I crossed the clearing without pausing, stepped back onto the track on the far side, and kept walking. My pulse thumped in my ears so loud it sounded like someone following. The sky was fading, that eerie blue turning to dusk. My eyes kept catching flickers, branches dipping, shapes sliding between trunks. The knocking started again, measured and patient, as if whoever was doing it had all night to wait. After what felt like hours, the track started climbing. My legs were so numb I was half dragging them uphill. But when I finally saw the gap in the trees ahead, a band of sky going purple and gold, I felt something loosen in my chest. I stumbled out onto cracked pavement, blinking in the last light. The highway stretched in both directions, empty and still. I turned back one last time. Between the trees in the dim space beyond that clearing, A tall shape was standing, just watching. No face, no movement. Headlights swung around the bend. I stepped into the road and waved both arms. The truck slowed, brakes hissing. "You all right?" the driver called, leaning out. I tried to answer, but my voice didn't cooperate. "Someone else out there with you?" He peered past me, squinting at the trees. I didn't say anything. I just climbed into the cab, shut the door, and held my pack tight against my chest. As the truck pulled away, I didn't look back. As a freelance cartographer, I spent more days than I'd ever admit to anyone drifting around back roads with a stack of old survey maps and a half-functioning GPS. It sounds a lot more glamorous than it really is. Most people picture some noble explorer in a Jeep, discovering hidden wonders. In reality, I spent most of my time alone, arguing with outdated directions and eating cold sandwiches in the front seat. That particular stretch of work started on a Wednesday in late September. I remember because I'd circled the date on my wall calendar at home. 3 days, in and out, no hassle. My last job had dragged on for almost 2 weeks because the county archive had mislabeled half the road markers. So I told myself this time would be different. Simple. I picked up a beige sedan from a rental lot on the edge of Adkins. The clerk handed over the keys and warned me that the radio sometimes cut out. I figured that was the least of my worries. By noon, I'd already been driving through the Elkford foothills for hours, the GPS flickering between 2 bars of service and nothing at all. Most of the roads out there barely qualified as maintained. I'd rattle over a strip of cracked asphalt and then, without warning, hit a section of gravel thick enough to shake my fillings loose. Every mailbox I passed looked like it hadn't seen mail in a decade. Tilted poles, peeling paint, grass climbing up the posts. Once, I spotted an old washing machine out in a field with a rusted lawn chair balanced on top of it. For some reason, that image stuck with me longer than anything else. After a while, I pulled over to check the printed reference sheet spread across the passenger seat. County Route 12B was easy enough to find. The line traced west, then connected to something called Bowater Hollow Road. According to the archive copy, Bowater was just a dirt track that looped back to the highway after 12 miles. I figured I'd knock it out by early afternoon. Finding the turnoff wasn't hard, but I still slowed down when I saw it. The entrance looked like it had been abandoned half a lifetime ago. 2 muddy ruts cut through a curtain of thorny greenbrier. A wooden sign, warped from rain and sun, sagged on one nail. You could just make out Bower, faded almost to nothing. I had this moment where I just sat there gripping the wheel, thinking about how nice it would be to keep driving and call it a clerical error. But that wasn't why I got into cartography. Even if the work was tedious, I liked knowing exactly what was out there. So I sighed, nudged the car forward, and watched the branches swallow me. The first few hundred feet were tight enough that leaves scraped against the side mirrors. Gravel turned into solid packed dirt, littered with broken glass. Brown bottles, mostly. The air inside the car felt stale and closed in, even though I'd cracked the window. Predictably, the GPS dropped signal before I'd gone 50 yards. At that point, I wasn't especially concerned. Half the places I mapped didn't show up on any live satellite feed anyway. But about 5 minutes in, I happened to glance at the little compass mounted on the dashboard. The needle drifted between north and east, like it couldn't decide where to land. I tapped the plastic casing. Nothing changed. I figured it was probably just a cheap unit, but something about the way it quivered unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I tried to shake it off. The track started to rise, winding up in these slow, rolling inclines. On my left, I spotted a stack of split logs leaning up against a pine tree. I made a mental note to watch for it later, just in case. On the right, there was a long line of fence posts marching into the trees, each topped with a little scrap of frayed red fabric, fluttering just enough to catch the eye. No sign of animals, no houses. It was the quiet that really got to me. No wind, no insects, no bird calls. Just the hum of the engine and the soft grind of tires over dirt. I tried switching on the radio, hoping for any local station, maybe a weather update, even static-laced bluegrass. But every frequency dissolved into the same fuzzy hiss. When the road curved around a bend, it narrowed so much I had to crawl along at 10 miles an hour. My attention slipped for a second, and when I looked up, my stomach clenched hard. The same pile of split logs was there again. Same angle, same chunk missing from the top piece. I didn't want to believe I'd circled around, but it was the only explanation. I pulled off to the edge and climbed out, my boots crunching over broken twigs. The air felt wrong, too heavy, like the trees were breathing down my neck. I walked a slow circle around the car, searching for any clue I'd somehow turned without realizing it. Nothing. Just moss and trees and the same quiet pressing in from all sides. When I slid back into the driver's seat and turned the ignition, the dash clock blinked 12:00. My phone was dead too. I hadn't even noticed it power down. A sour metallic taste rose in my mouth. I didn't feel afraid yet, just angry that the day had gotten this weird. I decided to keep going. I picked up speed, letting branches slap the side panels. A few minutes later, a flicker of motion caught my eye. On the right shoulder, a woman was walking. She wore a pale blue housecoat that trailed along the dirt, and her hair, long, thin gray, hung over her face. She moved with this slow, mechanical stride, never looking up. I braked hard. The engine idled in the hush. "Ma'am?" My voice came out sharper than I meant it to. She didn't react. "Do you need help?" "Nothing." She drifted past the car, step by step, then crossed behind the trunk and disappeared between two trees. I waited, straining to hear her footsteps. No sound at all. My hands were trembling when I finally pulled away. Another fork in the road came into view, and this time, a rough plank had been hammered into the dirt where the path split. Turn back. The paint was fresh enough it looked almost wet. For a few seconds, I thought about reversing all the way to the highway. But the idea of backing down that road, staring at the dark trees in my mirror, made my scalp prickle. So I picked the right fork and kept driving, telling myself it was the only rational choice. The landscape kept repeating. Same downed logs, same scatter of stones in the ditch. I knew the odometer said I'd traveled 30 miles, but it felt like I was trapped in a single patch of forest. Finally, the trees thinned ahead. The track rose up a short slope and broke into a clearing. There was a house in the middle of it, 2 stories, weathered boards stripped of paint. The porch sagged so low I wondered if it would collapse. One window gaped open on the second floor. I told myself I'd just turn around, but I didn't. My legs moved without my permission, carrying me across the yard. The porch groaned when I stepped onto it. The screen door swung free on a single hinge. I reached for the main door. Before my fingers touched the wood, it cracked open 3 inches. Darkness pressed inside, thick and unbroken. I waited. No movement, no voice, just my pulse banging in my ears. Every part of me wanted to run, but my body felt slow, like I was moving underwater. I backed away, 1 foot at a time, and stepped down off the porch. When I turned back to the car, I saw something shift behind the rear window. A slow, deliberate motion, like someone adjusting their weight from one leg to the other. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted, fumbling with the door handle, threw myself inside and slammed the locks down. My breath came in ragged gulps. The ignition caught on the second try. I threw it into reverse so fast the wheels spat gravel. This time, the road didn't split again. It stretched ahead in a straight line. I kept my foot down, watching the trees thin mile by mile. When the cracked yellow lines of the main highway reappeared, I nearly laughed. My hands hurt from gripping the wheels so hard. The second I pulled onto pavement, my phone lit up with a flurry of notifications, missed calls and text. I drove straight to a roadside motel in Grinnell, paid cash, locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle. Then I sat on the floor, back pressed to the bed, and left before sunrise. I was working as a field tech for this small environmental survey outfit out of Rockford. Not exactly the kind of gig you brag about to impress anybody, but it paid just enough to keep the lights on and gave me a lot of time to myself in places most folks never bother to think about. Honestly, I didn't mind it. I liked the quiet, the feeling that I was the only person for miles in any direction. Most weeks, I spent more nights crashed in borrowed trucks or half-clean motels than I ever did in my own lopsided apartment. You get used to it after a while. You learn which motels have decent coffee, which ones have locks you shouldn't trust, and which stretches of road are most likely to shake the muffler loose. That July, the office sent me out to document invasive plant growth along a patchwork of old back roads buried in the Calhoun foothills. On paper, it sounded straightforward. Drive a bunch of neglected county highways, snap photos of flagged kudzu and wisteria stands, and record coordinates to log back at headquarters. They told me I'd be done in 2 days, maybe 3 if something slowed me down. It was the third day before anything got strange. I ended up staying at the last site longer than I meant to. The flagged kudzu was wrapped behind a collapsing horse shed, half-eaten by vines. The coordinates my supervisor emailed me looked like somebody had typed them blindfolded. My tablet froze twice, and when it finally started working, it insisted I was standing in the middle of a grocery store 50 miles away. By the time I got the data logged and snapped all the photos, the sun had already ducked behind the ridgeline. Out there, when daylight goes, it doesn't ease into dusk. It just goes black all at once, like somebody flicked off the world's last working bulb. The van I had wasn't exactly inspiring confidence. It was a tired white cargo model with no rear windows and a starter that loved to fake me out. Sometimes it would pretend to turn over, then die with this pitiful little rattle that sounded like coughing. You'd have to coax it back to life by jiggling the keys and muttering threats under your breath. I got the engine going on the second try and pulled onto the road. My tablet, bolted to the dash with an arm that wobbled every time I hit a pothole, was supposed to guide me home. The route line kept flickering and blinking out, jumping my location back and forth by half a mile like it was trying to decide where reality stopped. I had a folded map on the passenger seat, one of those big laminated county ones. My supervisor had taken a blue pen and circled a route, told me it was a shortcut that had saved me an hour of backtracking to the main road. I remember him saying it twice. Completely reliable. Locals use it all the time. About 10 minutes in, the road turned into a tunnel of trees so dense my headlights just dissolved into the darkness. I stopped, seeing mailboxes. No fences, no hand-painted signs nailed to posts. Nothing but cracked blacktop and the occasional snag of barbed wire half buried in weeds. I told myself that was normal. You get used to emptiness in places like this. I tried to call the office just to confirm I hadn't drifted onto some private farm lane, but my phone didn't even pretend to look for signal. The little bars stayed flat and gray. Out of habit, I switched on the radio. All I got was a low hiss so constant it almost sounded like the static had been there forever, waiting for me to turn the volume up. I kept driving because there wasn't anything else to do. A while later, I glanced at the odometer and realized the trip counter had reset itself. It was sitting at 0. I hadn't touched the button. I pressed it again, thinking maybe it just glitched out. Nothing happened. For the next stretch, I stared down that endless strip of pavement, hoping to see something familiar. Just one landmark to prove I hadn't wandered in a circle. A bridge, a gravel turnout, even an old stump. But there was nothing. Eventually, my headlights caught a strip of white fabric tied tight around a sapling on the shoulder. It looked clean, too clean for some place so neglected. The cloth shifted just slightly, but I couldn't feel any breeze through the open driver's window. I slowed as I passed. In the mirror, it vanished in the dark. A few minutes later, something else appeared, a strip of bright orange tape nailed to a wooden stake. The wood looked brand new. I pulled over, engine still idling. When I opened the door and stepped out, the quiet felt like it was pressing down on my shoulders. heavier than it should have been. The tape looked like standard construction marker, the kind I'd seen 1,000 times. But there was no equipment, no gravel berms, no fresh tire tracks. Just that one stake standing there in the dirt. I didn't feel any urge to check closer. I got back in and pulled away. Time blurred into this steady rhythm of driving, checking the odometer, watching the dark. The road stayed perfectly straight. No curves, no forks, no dips. It felt like a hallway built just for me. I kept telling myself I hadn't turned around, hadn't lost my bearings, but the trip counter still wouldn't move. After a while, the shadows between the trees started to look like figures, like people standing there, watching. I blinked and rubbed my eyes until they watered. My heartbeat climbed into my throat and just stayed there. Then I saw it, cresting a shallow rise. A white SUV nosed into a ditch. The driver's door hung wide open, no hazards blinking, no dome light shining. I slowed down to almost a stop, squinting into the trees for any sign of someone waving me over. Nothing moved. The seats were empty except for a folded blanket. No footprints in the dirt. No broken branches suggesting someone had run off. I coasted past, keeping my eyes locked straight ahead. My first thought was that whoever owned it had gone to get help. My second thought was they hadn't left willingly. I kept driving because I couldn't think of any better plan. Another mile went by and then I started seeing more stakes. Bright orange tape nailed to clean wooden posts. They showed up every 20 feet along the shoulder, stretching into the trees like a path. I pulled over again, engine running. I counted them, 12 in all, before the line curved out of sight. No tracks, no tools, just the markers. I eased forward, hands slippery on the wheel. It didn't take long before they reappeared. Same spacing, same tape. I stopped again, flipped the map open across my knees. The blue line my supervisor drew ended at a junction that didn't exist. Nothing around me matched a single landmark on the map. I reversed until I'd passed the last stake and turned around. For the first time in what felt like hours, the trip counter started moving. 1 mile, 2, 3, but nothing changed. When I came back around the bend where the SUV had been, it was gone. No sign it had ever been there. No disturbed gravel, no drag marks, just empty shoulder. I didn't slow down. My chest was tight enough it felt like my ribs might crack. I focused on counting breaths. 4 in, 6 out. Just to keep from thinking too much about what any of it meant. Maybe 10 minutes later, a small wooden sign popped up on the right side. It was nailed to a post at an angle, like it had been put up in a hurry. The paint was black and uneven, letters slanted and rushed. Way out, with an arrow pointing left onto a narrow gravel track. I stopped. My brain felt like it was stuck in glue. Every instinct was screaming at me not to turn. But nothing in me believed the paved road was ever going to end. So I turned. The gravel narrowed fast, branches scraping along both sides of the van, sounding like fingernails on metal. I tried to keep my eyes fixed straight ahead, but the headlights picked out shapes I wish I hadn't seen. Bundles wrapped in faded tarp, coils of rope, a single boot half buried in the dirt. I passed them without slowing. The track curved hard to the right and opened into a clearing. A low cinder block building crouched at the far end, its metal door propped open with a brick. A lantern glowed inside. Dull yellow light barely spilling past the threshold. I braked, engine idling. My hands were shaking so badly I had to steady them against the wheel. Nothing moved. Then I reversed, tires spitting gravel. At the bend, my headlights swept over fresh tire tracks, crossing mine. Wide, deep treads that hadn't been there before. I didn't think. My heart jerked so hard it hurt. I turned the wheel and floored it, bumping over ruts and roots, past the sign until the cracked pavement reappeared. This time, the SUV never came back. No marker on the shoulder, no trace it had ever existed. I drove. I didn't let myself blink until I saw a giant billboard rising out of the trees, bright lights announcing a Sungo station 2 exits ahead. When I pulled under the buzzing floodlights, I just sat there, gripping the wheel until the ache in my wrists turned numb. It took me a minute before I trusted myself to look at my phone. Full signal, like nothing had ever been wrong. I locked the van, walked into the station without looking back, and decided right then I wasn't taking any more shortcuts for the rest of my life. That September, I picked up an assignment to chart a network of abandoned county routes curling through the western ridges near Alder Creek, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I figured it would take me 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather turned or I ran into a rock slide. I stocked up on cheap instant meals, a stack of paper maps I didn't really trust, and the tablet I used to log every twist and turn. I also threw in my old camping gear just in case I got stuck overnight somewhere without cell service. The first day felt routine. I drove along 6 or 7 roads that hadn't appeared on an official survey since Eisenhower was president. They were overgrown and rutted, lined with barns that looked one good storm away from collapsing. In a way, I liked that part. Recording things everyone else had decided weren't worth noticing. The next morning, I rolled out of Milford before dawn. The only place open was a gas station with a single pump and a cracked ice cooler. The guy behind the counter looked at me like I'd told him I was planning to count every pine tree. He rubbed his eyes and said, "There's nothing up there worth finding." I remember giving a little laugh. "That's the idea," I told him, and he just shook his head like he pitied me. By midday, I'd made it up past an old fire watchtower, the kind with rusty stairs spiraling up into nowhere. The air felt different up there, hushed and heavy, like the trees were waiting for something. My phone lost service right around the tower, which didn't bother me. I'd planned for that. What did bother me was how every landmark started blurring together. The same stand of pines cropped up again and again. At first I thought I'd made a wrong turn, but every time I checked my notes, they said I was exactly where I should be. That's when I spotted it. A break in the trees, so narrow I almost passed it by. It looked more like a game trail than a road. Just a thin, cracked ribbon of pavement vanishing into the woods. No sign. No fresh tire tracks. My GPS showed nothing but a blank grid of squares. I put the Jeep in park and wrote down the coordinates in my notebook. For a few seconds, I just sat there, tapping the pen against the dash. Part of me wanted to skip it and find something easier to document, but the idea of a road that didn't exist anywhere else, a place no one bothered to remember, felt like the exact reason I'd taken the job. I eased over the threshold, and the suspension gave a protesting creak as the front tires hit broken asphalt. Low branches tapped along the roof like fingertips. Half a mile in, the trees pressed so close I had to flick on the headlights. The pavement looked untouched. No ruts, no footprints, just a scatter of sticks and a few smooth river rocks. I rolled the windows down a few inches, telling myself the breeze would help clear my head. I crawled along in first gear. Another mile went by, and I started noticing something that made my scalp prickle. The shadows across the road didn't match the angle of the sun. I leaned forward over the wheel, squinting. The light was almost directly overhead, but long slanted shapes stretched across the asphalt, like they'd been cast by something taller than the trees. I pulled over and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet felt too complete, like the woods were holding their breath. I got out and stood in the middle of the road, studying the shadows. My heart thumped a little harder than I liked. I moved side to side, trying to find the angle where the shapes lined up with the branches. Nothing did. When I looked back down the road, the shadows had shifted. They were longer, reaching almost to my boots. I told myself I was tired, probably dehydrated. I tried to open the compass app on my phone, but the screen stayed black, just a faint glow that didn't resolve into anything useful. That was when I turned toward the Jeep and saw the rocks. They'd been arranged in a perfect row across the hood, each pale and round, like someone had picked them carefully. My pulse jumped so hard I had to steady myself against the fender. I hadn't heard anything, no footsteps, no branches cracking, just that smothered quiet. I brushed the rocks onto the shoulder, telling myself it had to be some prank or leftover marker from a survey crew decades back. I almost believed it, till I walked another 20 yards up the road and turned around. Another row of rocks sat in the middle of the lane. This time they formed a crooked arrow pointing deeper into the trees. My mouth went dry. I felt a bead of sweat run down my spine. I backed up slowly, stopping when my shoulder bumped the Jeep's mirror. I climbed in and slammed the door hard enough to make the glass rattle. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles hurt. I told myself I'd reverse all the way back to the turnoff. Simple, just take it slow. I eased into reverse. The tires crackled over leaves and gravel. For a few minutes, nothing moved. I tried not to blink, not to think about how the shadows seemed to crawl along the edges of my vision. Then I felt the bumper tap something solid. I looked up and saw another stack of rocks, higher than the others, almost up to the headlights. I think I forgot to breathe. My throat felt too tight. I killed the engine and cracked the door. My hands shook as I reached for the handle. I leaned out, straining to hear anything. But there was nothing. No birds, no wind. Just that blank, smothering silence. I kicked the rocks aside, my boots sliding on loose pebbles. My heart thudded so hard it almost hurt. I kept telling myself if I just got back to the main road, I'd never have to think about this place again. I got back in and shifted into drive. The idea of reversing again felt impossible. The road widened after another 10 minutes. I thought I'd finally find a spot to turn around. My shoulders started to unclench. Then I came around a bend and saw the pavement end in a wall of tangled undergrowth. I sat there, engine idling, staring at the brush. My breath came in short, shallow gulps. In the mirror, something flickered between the trees. Just a shape, quick and silent. I didn't look twice. I threw it in reverse and started inching backward, every nerve in my body waiting for the next line of rocks. But instead, I rolled into a junction I hadn't noticed. A cracked road cut across the path, leading left and right. I didn't think. I turned right, just desperate to be anywhere else. 5 minutes later, I noticed the pavement had changed. It had gone pale, almost white under the tires. I slowed to a crawl. A wooden sign lay face down in the grass. I left the engine running and stepped out. My hands didn't feel steady as I flipped it over. Someone had carved numbers into the plank by hand, coordinates. I read them again and again before I understood. They were the same numbers I'd written down when I first found the turnoff. It didn't matter how far I drove. I ended up right back here. My vision went fuzzy around the edges. I let the sign drop and stumbled back to the Jeep. I didn't check the mirrors after that. I kept my eyes straight ahead, hands locked on the wheel. I don't know how long I drove. The shadows kept shifting, and the road never seemed to end. Then finally, I saw a clearing. A squat brown ranger station, faded flag out front like some cheap mirage. I pulled in so fast the tires threw gravel against the siding. My phone buzzed back to life, a single bar of service flickering in and out. I called Darren, one of my colleagues at the department. I tried to keep my voice calm. "There's no roads past the collapsed bridge," he said, sounding puzzled. "I'm looking right at the archive. It's just forest." I didn't answer right away. My throat felt scraped raw. "I'll figure it out," I told him. He started to ask if I was okay. I hung up before he finished. I deleted every waypoint, every note, every track log. Then I shut off the engine and rested my forehead against the wheel. I sat there until my breathing finally slowed. I didn't drive back into those ridges the rest of my life.